February 4th. And we are going to open our State Land Board meeting, and I'm going to turn it over to Director Walker. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you. It's a beautiful day outside, a little frisky. Left the gloves in the suitcase, but we'll get those out later. So I just wanted to let you know at your places there's a couple of documents that have been posted to the web. Agenda item 3 is our updated LCs, and I'll get to that in the course of the morning. Also, you'll see a PERS distribution that I'll talk about under item 7 when we get the financial audit report, and you're going to be very pleased to see that. And then finally, you'll see the memo on the South Slough Reserve Forest and Fire Management Project, and that is under other today, under agenda item 8. I sent that all to you, but I've also put it at your places, along with a letter from the Confederated Tribes of the Kuzla-Uramqua-Siuslaw Indians talking about the great work we collaborated with on that project. So we'll get to that in the course of our morning. And with that, I'll start out with our first agenda item, which is on the consent agenda, request for approval of the minutes of the December 10, 2019 State Land Board meeting.
Now I have to remember to turn the microphone on. Thank you to your team for their hard work on this issue. Secretary Clarno unable to join us today. I'll let the record show that she is excused, and turn it over to Treasurer Reed for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move approval of the minutes as presented.
Treasurer Reed moved approval of the minutes of the December 10th, 2019 Land Board meeting. Hearing and seeing no objection, the motion is approved.
All right, we'll move on to the action items. Action item 2 is going to be moved to our April agenda. We had an internal issue with that, so you'll see that one in April. We'll move on to item 3, which are the legislative concepts for 2021. And oh my goodness, here we are only in the 2020 session, and we're talking about legislative concepts. So, we need the Land Board to authorize the department to proceed with drafting those 2021 legislative concepts to submit to the Department of Administrative Services for review and drafting in preparation for pre-session filing. Unfortunately, the schedule's really close, so that's why we're here today. The schedule for those legislative concepts requires all agencies to submit proposals to DAS for review by April 17th, hence we are here today. DAS and the Governor's Office then will complete their review by May 29th, 2020, when I am 64. When I said that this morning, I said, wait a minute, there's a Beatles song, and it's one of my favorites, so I printed out the lyrics, and it's a pretty cool song. So on May 29th...
The question is whether it was Paul McCartney or John Lennon song.
That was Paul McCartney.
Okay, thank you.
So it's really terrific. Birthday greetings, bottle of wine. Yes, indeed. All right. So after May 29th, by November 13th, 2020, agencies must submit draft concepts to DAS and the Governor's Office for final approval. And the deadline for pre-session filing is then December 4, 2020. There'll be multiple opportunities to fine-tune all of that for our stakeholders as we move along, but we just need to get these on the table and approved so we can begin that extensive outreach and work. So let me just kind of quickly run through these. We have a request from my section, which is a placeholder bill in anticipation of the legislative or statutory needs to move forward on the transfer of the Elliott State Forest to be operated as a research forest under the University of Oregon's College of Forestry. The second item is citation authority for removal fill granted to Oregon State Police. We're still working with Oregon State Police on this one, but it's something that we've discussed in the past with them. Currently the only recourse for even minor removal fill violations for the department is through the administrative process, which seems lengthy and time consuming for very simple but serious problems with our removal fill violations. And in some cases, it would be easier for OSP, Oregon State Police, to issue a citation with a lesser fine to quickly resolve those violations, while we can also educate the responsible party. This will apply in cases where we don't have any remediation that needs to be done because they've done something very serious. So we're still working with OSP to make sure they're on board with that. The next one is the abandoned and derelict vessels and camping. That's a placeholder bill. As you have seen throughout the past year, we've brought those issues before you. It's a serious problem, increasing health and safety, complaints relating to unauthorized use of public lands and waterways. We're not quite sure where we're going with that legislative concept yet. We have a stakeholder group in process, and we'd just like to keep that open and develop that. The next come from the Unclaimed Property Program. The first two, the Senate Bill 454 that the legislature passed in 2019 will transfer the Unclaimed Property Program to the Department of Treasury, but we're not there yet, and we are collaborating very well, and there will be some statutory changes and fixes that we'll have to bring forward, and I think the treasurer agrees with that. I see a nod of the head. The next two are bills that you saw last session. We had some drafting errors with those, and so we're running these again. The abandoned unpaid wages are reported to the department every 3 years from the date the owner, the payee, last had contact with the employer. The states adjacent to Oregon use a federal Uniform Unclaimed Property Act, and that requires only 1 year, so we'd like to have some consistency. We anticipate that we'll have more success with the drafting and be much more successful this session. Likewise, the investment securities, most states align with the standards found in the Federal Uniform Unclaimed Property Act of 2016, but Oregon law differs. And so we've had financial institutions report securities that are not in fact unclaimed, and that causes all kinds of problems. So we're just simply asking to come in alignment with federal standards. And finally, in the unclaimed property section, we'd like a public records exemption. I know all of us were in the legislature, and I was really a strong proponent of limiting those exemptions, as I'm sure you were. But in this case, I think we have a serious concern. We would like to keep all the information related to an unclaimed property audit as exempt from public records disclosure until the audit is complete and the findings report is issued. We'd like to keep the claims documentation exempt without the claimant's consent, having that information made public. The reason for this is that the department holds sensitive information for hundreds of thousands of individuals, employers, and contractors, from tax and vital records to bank account numbers, proprietary information, audit-related data, sometimes birth certificates. These are items that, if we disclose those and made them available to the public, would lead to fraud. It would also reduce the department's ability to bring companies in compliance, and quite frankly, Oregonians would be afraid to make an application because their information, their personal private information, would be public. So our proposed concept would revise ORS 192.35516 to include audit records from being exempted until the audit is completed, and claims documentation to be exempt from disclosure without the claimant's consent.
Sorry, I got to remember to turn on the microphone. Director Walker, I am, as you know, have been working in the field of public records for a while now, and particularly as a former Secretary of State, I'm curious why current statutes don't apply already, because I remember specifically a bill that I worked on when I was Secretary of State to prohibit release of audit findings until the audit was complete. So I'd love to hear from the Secretary of State's team, maybe at the next land board meeting, why current statute doesn't prohibit this information from being released during the course of an audit.
Yes, Madam Chair, Governor, that would be appropriate, and I don't know if a member of my staff can answer that. Matthew can.
Oh, thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Director Walker. Governor, my understanding is that provision only applies to internal audits, and this is an audit done by a third party. So
Audit,
that
okay.
exemption.
And what we used to call outhouse audits, so, okay. All right, thank you.
Outhouse audits.
In-house versus outhouse, so. All very valuable.
All right, well, and as you know, the Secretary of State can no longer audit the land board functions here at the Department of State Lands because it's a conflict, because the Secretary sits on the
Got it, okay. All right. Oh, that answers the question. Thank
All
you.
right. Then the final ask would be a request from the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, the first research reserve in the country. The South Slough is currently defined as the South Slough of Coos Bay from Volino Island southward. Lands have been acquired by and managed by the department north of that, and they're required to be identified as special stewardship lands. These lands are managed by the reserve team, but they're located outside of the reserve boundary, so we can't use federal funding for management of these stewardship lands because they're located outside of the designated boundary. Well, we all know how important it is for us to gather those federal dollars to assist us as much as we can, and so what we'd like to do is amend the language in ORS 273.553 to allow all lands managed by the South Slough to be included in the official reserve boundary. There's no cost involved, but it gets those lands in the boundary so we can utilize those federal dollars. So that is the extent of the list. We had one on there and we took that off. It was a placeholder for 404 Assumption because that was a legislative concept that passed, and we felt that was best handled through the legislative process with the group over there that was heading up that issue.
The chair moves the authorization to proceed with drafting legislative concepts to be submitted to the Department of Administrative Services for the 2021 legislative session.
I'm sure, may I ask a question? on
Sure,
that
of
topic?
course.
Thank you. I was debating whether to interrupt at the moment when
No,
it
it's
was
good.
described. Can you help me remember, Director Walker, the experience we had with respect to derelict vessels? I'm recalling some discussion of a concept around requiring or allowing insurance and various things, and does that fit into your description here of not quite sure where you're headed with derelict vessels?
Yes, Governor and Treasurer Reed, we talked about that last session. It immediately hit a wall, so we needed to work on that concept a bit more, and that will be part of that big, broad issue area of how can we avoid this, how can we work with the leaseholders, because I think that's an issue. Some of the marinas have these boats that are abandoned, and then they sell them for $1, knowing they're going to a homeless person that's going to use it in the waterway illegally. So we're still looking at how do we handle that. It's a very difficult legal landmine, as Mr. DeVore has pointed out to me on several occasions as we've tried to find an answer. We're looking at Washington State has been doing. They've been somewhat successful, but I will also tell you that Washington State's folks have moved into Oregon because our laws are a bit different. So we're seeing one state's problem becoming another state's problem.
I'm thinking of that Goebel experience, particularly in the
Yeah.
requirement around the insurance, but that is contemplated to be part of this LC as well?
That is my hope.
Great. Very good.
I don't know if my staff is thinking that, but that's my hope.
There's one nod behind you. Yes.
Yeah,
Thumbs up.
because I don't want another $12 million problem in my lap.
Nor do we, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
I'm happy to second your motion.
Thank you. No other questions? Sorry, I was like, okay, let's move. Seeing no objection to the motion carries.
All right, agenda item 4. I'm going to be joined at the table by our illustrious unclaimed property manager, Claudia Chabano. If I pronounced that incorrectly, let me know, but I've been practicing.
It's okay.
It's a beautiful name. It rolls off the tongue. We have a wonderful trust property program and a report for you today. I've read over it several times with Claudia, and I think you're going to be very pleased about our work. There you go.
Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Governor Brown, Treasurer Reed. It's a pleasure to be here. For the record, my name is Claudia Chabano. I am the Trust Property Manager. It's a pleasure, like I said, to be here and present to you on the last 2 years of program accomplishments. In the interest of full disclosure, I have to tell you that I can take no credit for any of these accomplishments. I've been in my role for about 7 months. So most of that time has been spent drinking from the proverbial fire hose. These two programs are very challenging. They have a steep learning curve, but they're very fascinating. So thank you in advance. I will try to answer all your questions today. So as you very well know, the two programs are unclaimed property and interstate estate administration. Unclaimed property is the larger of the two programs in terms of money coming in and going out and the number of resources dedicated. At its core, it's meant to protect the property interests of owners. It's the location where property comes so that it is one central location for people to come and claim their lost funds, their lost funds. And they're really not that lost. It's just what that business is in organizations called holders. When they no longer can keep in touch with the owners, they send those funds to us so we can keep them for them and then they can be claimed. The program has seen many changes. It's now a lot more complex because it applies to all of the industries out there and it applies to a wide variety of properties, and we hold it in perpetuity. We only used to hold them for about 25 years. Every year, we receive about $65 million, and we pay out about half in claims, so that means that there's quite a bit of money left over. The balance in that, your report will say it's $670 million. Since then, we received our last reporting in October and November, so we're up to $750 million, and that is held in the Common School Fund, which, as you all know, is invested for the benefit of Oregon's public education. There's two sides to unclaimed property. One works with the businesses to bring in the money, and the claim side works with individuals to reunite them with their property. They work in tandem, and they have very different roles. So the holder reporting team, they work on educating and advising holders on how to meet unclaimed property statutes and complying with rules. They audit holders to ensure compliance. They verify the reports, and they make that money available to be claimed by property owners. The claims team, they have a very difficult role because they come in after the holders have already tried to locate property owners, and now they have to employ better, greater tools to find them. So when they do, then they walk them through the claims process, and then they approve and validate those claims and get them paid. In the last few years, we've received more money and we paid out more money in claims. So unclaimed property is on the upswing. 2019 was our top year, almost $70 million received and about $35 million that we paid out. The part that I'm most proud of this incredible team is what they've been able to accomplish. They've hosted 20 free unclaimed property reporting workshops. They've processed more than 14,000 holder reports, and they posted more than 1 million properties on our website. And that's really a team of two people. So I'm not sure. Carolyn's there. Carolyn and Andrea, they're doing a fantastic job. A lot of work on two people. And I don't know when they found the time, but they also found the time to coordinate our contract auditors to complete 750 audits that returned about $10 million in unclaimed property to the state. We also conducted our own audits, and that was about 91 audits of Oregon companies that have never filed, about $320,000 in past due funds. And what's really amazing about this, that it's only one person. Our auditor, Agatha, does a great job, and that's about one audit per week. So that's fantastic work by her. Our claim staff, about 3,600 claims that they've done in the last 2 years on 24,000 properties. But what's really unique is that over the $65 million that they paid out in claims over the last couple of years, a third of that value was due to their direct research efforts. And about 20% of those claims were as a direct of the research effort. So that's 3 folks who are claims examiners and 2 program analysts, so really fine work by them. In addition to all of this claim work and research work that they do, they've seen an increase in garnishment. That's taken up almost 30% of their time. So they're doing their part to help state and local governments, partners, and still keep up with their regular claims work. The one thing that the team would like me to mention, and I know it's important to DSL as well, is that while we've kept up with the work, the workload has increased dramatically, and we are now not able to provide quite the same customer service level that we did in the past, and we're not meeting the statutory deadlines for responding to claims. For about 2 years, we've seen this problem. The most somebody had to wait was 7 months at the end of last year. We're supposed to keep it to 120 days or fewer. We've added some temporary staff, and that's providing some help. We tried to add additional staff during the 2019 session. That was unsuccessful, unfortunately. We're going again in February, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that we can get staffed up properly so that we can do right by our customers. So that's the part of unclaimed property. The interstate estate administration.
Quick question.
Absolutely.
The position, is it GF or state school funds?
I believe all of ours are
State school fund. Great. Okay. So it's not a general fund.
correct.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
But it was denied in the last session, and I'm not sure why. It was just taken off.
The Interstate Estate Administration, it's a fascinating program. The Constitution tells us to manage the estates of residents who die without a will and without known heirs. Our goal is always to find heirs as soon as possible. Until we do, we act as the personal representatives of the estate, and we fulfill a very long list of fiduciary duties. We work closely with DOJ to make sure that we follow the process. We manage estates that range from close to being destitute to multi-million-dollar estates, and if no heirs come forward in about 10 years from a person's death, then those assets become a permanent part of the common school fund. Millions of dollars pass through.
Just a quick
Hang on
question
just a
that.
second. Treasurer Reed, go ahead.
Sure. When you said permanently, that's a piece that I stuck on both in what you said and when you wrote. Permanently means that it's there, but heirs who do become, of whom we do become aware could make a claim on that. Is that correct? Or
So that is the important distinction between unclaimed property and the estate part of the program. Unclaimed property, we keep in perpetuity. For the estate part, they only have 10 years to claim it. After 10 years, it permanently escheats to the common school fund. So I'm not sure exactly why the reason, but that is an important distinction between the two programs.
thank you for clarifying.
Absolutely.
Mr. DeVore, did you have a comment about that? I saw you nodding your head, but you're aware of the distinction.
Yes, Governor. I thought the explanation was perfect, spot on. Yeah.
Right, and this is, Governor and Land Board members, this is why it's really important. This is an important issue for me. I want to work with the Oregon State Bar. I'd like to get more public service announcements out. People shouldn't be dying without a will. I say that, and I don't even have a will, but at least my son lives right next door. You know, we shouldn't be dying without a will. You shouldn't have the state of Oregon coming in and pawing through your things. And as Claudia said, some of these are multi-million-dollar estates. I don't understand why someone who has that much money doesn't have a will to make sure their money goes to where they'd like it to go, to a charity of their choice if they don't have family. But we really need to do some outreach, and I'll be the first to say it's time for me to get that done. But clearly, it's not our goal to keep people's money. But that's the law. After 10 years, if no one shows up, then it's permanently escheated to the state of Oregon and the Common School Fund. So I really want to, that's one of the things in our communications plan that I'd like to see more outreach done about the estates. And it is pretty frightening. I've been out with our staff to a home that has no heirs. People have died in the home. It can be rather unsettling. So it is a very important part of our program, but I'd really like to educate the public some more. So back to you, my dear.
Yes, if people do die without heirs and without a will, the team that goes and secures their property, I assure you, they're very nice and they do a very respectful job. They take care of millions of dollars in assets. And what's really important about this program is that it protects those assets from falling into the hands of people who don't have a claim over them. This team has a really tough job. Reports should be coming in to us within 48 hours of somebody's death. That may or may not happen, and we're expected to respond with an on-site visit within 5 days. The team educates Oregon businesses about these statutory requirements. They inventory, safeguard, and they liquidate assets to preserve their value. They administer the assets, they satisfy creditors, they search for heirs, and some of that is work that we do directly, or we hire genealogy researchers. What's fascinating to me is that sometimes we deal with overseas heirs and estates, and that is a completely different ballgame when you're trying to validate international heirship claims and use forensic genealogists. We file taxes, and then of course we complete all of the legal process for estate administration.
I'm going to just interrupt here because I want to hit on this point too. We also have heirs who don't want to deal with the problem. So we have run across that as well. They complain to me sometimes because our folks have asked them to come and take care of the issues. But we are very respectful about it, and the staff is very respectful when we go in and handle their things. I will say, Governor, I'd like you to know that with your executive order about Native American cultural resources, I attended a meeting of the advisory group working on that, and I had an aha moment that, because I didn't think we had anything here, but as I was sitting listening to the other agencies go around the table, I said, wait a minute, we have unclaimed property. And so we are working internally to figure out how to identify those resources, and also when we hire folks to come in and educate them about what to look for in terms of Native American cultural resources, because we don't know what we're going to encounter, and sometimes those houses are filled with capacity with all kinds of things, and if you don't know what you're looking for, it could just be tossed. So I do want you to know we're taking that seriously and working through that.
Thank you.
Okay, back to you.
Absolutely. So if we were talking about the growth in unclaimed property before, I would say in the estates there's been a massive explosion of cases. In 2014, we had 274 reported cases. Last year, 1,149. Over the last 6 years, the program has doubled every 3 years. It's amazing. We do a good job of finding heirs, as you can see in your table too on page 4. The majority of those estates, we find heirs for them. What's tricky is the point at which we find heirs, and they are willing to take over the estate part. Sometimes they wait until halfway through, and sometimes we don't find them until closer to the end. So as you can see, we administer either partially or fully quite a few estates. That's when we're talking about 36 to 41 fully administered estates. That's like managing 36 to 40 households. And what's really incredible to me, this work is done by 2 people. And I'm not sure if Sally and Greg are in the room, but if they are amazing. They do a tremendous amount of work. I don't know how they do it. They've operated above capacity for a long time. And I'll be honest, every time I drive to work, I hope none of them win the lottery because I'm not sure what we're going to do without them. But they do a fantastic job. And so in the last 2 years, they administered more than $5 million in estates. They managed 23 homes, sold 11 homes, countless cars, guns, coins, household items. We paid almost $1 million to heirs. We permanently escheated $355,000 to the Common School Fund, and we set aside another $3.1 million. Our priority for this program, I'd say, for 2020 is to really understand what it takes to fully administer and do a good job, and find the resources to staff the program appropriately. Do you have any other questions about the programs? We can talk a little bit about the goals and the recent changes that don't apply to fiscal year 18 or 19, but they're pretty exciting. I'm sure you know about our change to a new unclaimed property system. We could talk a little bit about that, but I also know that you have a lot more on your agenda. Okay. So one of the biggest changes we've made in September we changed unclaimed property software. We went to a CAP system offered by a very professional business called Kelmar. What's really amazing about the system is that it's made both the reporting side more efficient and the claim side more efficient. Reports can be uploaded automatically. We added an ACH debit payment, so now payments can come in, which has saved a lot of time in terms of reporting, processing checks, and we will continue to add enhancements to it. On the claim side, and this is really important to so many of the folks who are trying to claim their property back, they now can do it all electronically. Before, they would mail in their documents. Now they can upload everything electronically. And what's even more exciting is that for claims of $2,500 or less, if it's only a single owner and if we have the right data, the system will automatically validate it, and the payment will be issued within days. That's been really amazing. We implemented that system at the beginning of September, and since then we've had about 6,000 claims that were auto-approved. A huge improvement for our claimants. The value is not tremendous. It's about $700,000, but that's, of course, because these are very small claims. Since the implementation of the system, just to give you a context, we've approved 8,400 claims. So about 6,000 of those were auto. So that will give you a sense of how much work our claims examiners have to put in when we need to validate claims and look at additional documents. And we continue to work with the many stakeholders in educating them about the rules and how to comply with the law. And as Director Walker said, we're going to continue to make improvements so that we can align with the Uniform Unclaimed Property Act. For the estates team, we do need to improve our outreach statewide, and we also would like to implement a much easier reporting system for cases of individuals who die without a will or no one heirs. And like I mentioned, is trying to figure out what does it take to operate this program sustainable. Any additional questions or thoughts?
Looks like we don't have any further questions.
Great.
Thank you very much for your extensive report. Want to say thank you to you and your team for doing an outstanding job under really challenging circumstances, and hopefully we can work together to encourage the legislature to at least get you one more FTE.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Governor, and board members, the appendices will show a graph chart showing the exponential increase in claims and deaths that we've had and intestate cases, which is kind of interesting to look at.
Looks like a fourfold increase. It's a
Yeah,
lot.
it's pretty extensive, and I would encourage, you know, when I was in the legislature, this was always the most fascinating report in Judiciary Committee that we had. There was a scholarly, elderly gentleman who would come in and give us this report, and it was fascinating. But all of you should just occasionally put your name in our system, put your family member's name in the system, and you might find you're owed some money. I found my daughter's husband is owed $100 for some refund after he had moved. So they're going to go ahead and make that claim, and as Claudia mentioned, that'll be an auto claim, and they should see it in a few days. But they haven't done it yet, so we'll still make money on that $100 while it sits there. All right, our next exciting informational item is the Common School Forest Land Annual Report from the Oregon Department of Forestry. I'm going to invite Peter Doherty and Liz Dent up to give that report, and I'll step aside and rejoin you for item 6. Right behind me. Great.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you both for joining us today. Good to see you.
Good morning, Governor Brown and members of the Land Board. I'm glad to be here, and it's good to see you as well. For the record, my name is Peter Doherty, and I serve as Oregon State Forester and the Director of the Department of Forestry. Joining me at the table is our State Forest Division Chief, Liz Dent. Today, we'll briefly review the division's annual report highlighting economic outcomes for managing common school forest lands. We manage about 33,000 acres of common school land distributed around the state from the northwest border of the state in Astoria to the Oregon-California border down by Klamath. Forest and landscape conditions vary widely across this geographic region, as do the management opportunities and constraints. Many of the lands are scattered parcels, and others adjoin our Board of Forestry lands. The bulk of the lands, roughly 21,000 acres, are located in Tillamook, Lincoln, Josephine, and Klamath counties. Net revenues generated from our management of common school forest lands are dedicated to the Common School Fund. Under a management agreement between the Oregon Department of Forestry and Department of State Lands, we manage these forests to provide the greatest benefit to Oregonians consistent with the resource conservation and sound land management strategies. The agreement requires ODF to present an annual report to the Land Board on the management of these common school forest lands. And I will turn it over to Liz to provide some highlights from the report.
Great, thank you. Is that on? Is that going? There it goes. Great, good morning. Thank you, Peter. Good morning, Governor Brown, members of the board. For the record, my name's Liz Dent, and I serve as the State Forest Division Chief with the Oregon Department of Forestry. So as Peter discussed, the State Forest Division actively manages these common school forest lands using sound techniques of forest management, and these approaches are described in our forest management plans, which are approved both by the Board of Forestry and yourselves as a state land board. Forest activities, management activities include laying out timber sales, which involves forest inventory, resource assessments, and auctions of timber sales. Foresters work with purchasers and operators to ensure that the harvest operations are being implemented in accordance with best management practices and in compliance with the terms of the contract. Our foresters oversee road construction and maintenance, and they spend a fair amount of time, because of the scattered nature of the parcels, seeking and maintaining easements for accessing our lands, typically, well, across other ownerships, both public and private. We commit significant resources to creating and maintaining healthy, productive forests, and this starts with successful reforestation. We typically characterize this as young stand management and includes activities such as preparing a site for reforestation, planting trees, thinning young stands, all of which promote these forest conditions. We conduct reforestation checks that help us ensure that we are successful in our reforestation efforts, and at times identify a need for interplanting or going back in and planting some additional trees where seedlings may have died. We work with contractors to conduct surveys for threatened and endangered species, and our biologists work closely in collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to plan and conduct management activities that minimize risks to northern spotted owls and marbled murrelets. Our biologists and aquatic specialists work with foresters to assure proper implementation of conservation measures. We also conduct a public input process soliciting comments on our annual operation plans, and as well as what we call implementation plans, which are 10-year plans designed district by district. So with all of that in mind, our management costs this year were $1.37 million, and that's up from last fiscal year, which was $1.32 million. 4.7 million board feet was harvested off of these common school forest lands as compared to 3.6 million board feet in fiscal year 2018. $1.9 million was transferred to the Common School Fund. So while revenue was lower in fiscal year 19, revenue was lower in fiscal year 2019 as compared to fiscal year 2018, even though the volume was up. So this is largely because our average stumpage prices, which are shown in the report, were significantly lower than they have been historically. So just wanted to explain that a little bit for folks. Most of our sales volume, about 85%, came from pine sales, and those typically draw a much lower stumpage than the other species that we harvest. And then we did a lot of thinning of small diameter wood in the 6 to 11 inch diameter class, which also tends to bring lower stumpage prices. And then a very small percentage of the volume, roughly less than 2%, actually came from larger trees of around 70 years old or older. And these tend to bring much higher stumpage.
Treasurer Reed, I thought this topic might raise some issues. Treasurer Reed, take it away.
I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from all of us, but one that occurs to me right now is this question of stumpage. So I noticed that and the really significant difference later on in the report. You mentioned some things around the species and the size and other sorts of things. Are there market dynamics at play here too, or what other things if you know size and species, how confident are you about what it's going to be? What other factors should we be thinking about?
Well, Governor Brown, Treasurer Reed, it is market conditions which drive all of this. So that's what drives the stumpage, and it has to do with housing starts and which in turn drive timber value. And so we can predict housing starts to a certain extent, and actually have been doing fairly well with that over the years. But as you look back at the Great Recession, that's an example. When you're tied to the timber market, everything, and it goes down, so do our revenues. We know that pine does bring a lower stumpage, but much of the areas down in the southwest and in Klamath County they're mixed conifer stands, and when we go in and manage those stands, there's actually a lot of pine that comes from that. Does that answer your question?
To some extent, I guess it's just the follow-up is what other things should we be thinking about looking forward on these questions?
Did you want to answer?
Something we could do to raise the stumpage prices?
Or at least make them predictable. or the volume and the revenue. If we're thinking about what revenue comes to the Common School Fund. All these factors contribute to that. So the predictability is attractive, I think.
Yeah, and I would say that we used to have a lot more predictability when we had a much larger land base. So now we're down to we're managing only 33,000 acres, and so the age distribution in that, it's very hard to maintain a sort of a even age distribution. So we're following good silvicultural practices. So in this year, the location to do treatments happened to be in Klamath with long hauls and lower value species. So, I won't, it'd be really hard to try to even out the flow of that. And if you thought about that economically, while that would give you more certainty about what comes in, it wouldn't actually increase your return, because you might then delay in order to even out the flow of revenue, when in fact we should be harvesting them at the appropriate time, if that makes sense.
It does, although I guess I would just also say predictability doesn't have to mean stability. It can mean we know what's coming, even if it's different. And that if you knew that, that's better. I didn't know that it was going to be this volatile, but I get the point.
Yeah, no, that's a really good, now that I understand your question, we could do better, and I think this year we projected the volume, but we didn't project the price.
We have and I was going to get to that, we do
Yeah.
have a projected both volume and revenue for next year. So we do, every year, do those projections. So part of it is stumpage, which we can predict based on some economic models around the timber market. And then we can also predict how much volume we think we're going to be putting out. And that changes, our certainty around that prediction changes over the farther out we project. And so in the early, next couple of years, we know what's sold. Like, we know that is sold, so we know that volume's going to be coming in. So the first years out, we feel good. And then we start relying on planned sales. So these are sales that haven't yet been auctioned yet. So the certainty goes down, but we still feel pretty good. And then after that, we turn to 5-year averages. And so that's just predicting the volume. And then the stumpage is part of that, which is how we get to a predicted revenue.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about the planting, replanting, reforestation issues. And I'm curious whether your practices have changed in the last 5 years, given what we're seeing in terms of climate, water, rain instability, and that sort of thing.
Thank you, Governor Brown. There are some significant changes we made, and the biggest one being that we're planting larger trees. And so they hit the ground, so to speak, with a leg up, in terms of competing vegetation, because in drought conditions, that's a large part of what we're talking about, is when they're competing for the resources on the site. So bigger trees do better in that situation. And then we have a seed orchard that is working very successfully to genetically improved seed sources, some of which are going to be, are being considered for the purposes of better withstanding drought conditions. And then finally, for our Tillamook district, where we have significant disease called Swiss needlecast, and we're going to be needing to reforest those areas with trees that are resistant to Swiss needlecast. And so there's some work being done as well at the seed orchard for that. You're welcome. Okay, gotta remember where I was. Where was I? Okay, so I just got done talking about the difference between revenue and volume as compared to previous years and stumpage prices. So as we look into the future, we were just talking about projections, and we anticipate being in the black again next fiscal year. Our projection is that we'll, for fiscal year 20, we'll harvest 5.6 million board feet, and the cost will be approximately $1.47 million. And so, forgot to carry my data over in terms of how much revenue is going to come from that volume, but I can get that back to you later.
Hang on just a minute. Treasurer Reed.
One more time, I'm sorry for the interruption, but just before we move to the next topic, I fear that I must be missing something obvious here, so I better ask. You've helped me understand why the revenue would be down while volume is up because of the stumpage. But why directionally then is net operating income up? Wouldn't it follow in the same direction?
Governor Brown, Treasurer Reed, the part of that, well, the reason that those numbers play out like they do is that the stat you're asking about is net operating income, right. The net operating income is calculated in this report on total revenue received by the Department of Forestry, which was that $2,319,717,000. And then you subtract our management costs from that.
It's a different base. It's not just the, okay.
Different than revenue transferred.
That would be very helpful to understand. It's a different base. I was
Yeah.
really struggling with that. Thank you.
And yes, you're welcome. And in the future, we can report that differently. This is consistent with how we've reported in the past. So whatever works best for everyone, we're happy to do.
You will be pleased to know it confused me as well.
Thank you.
So that ends the formal part of my presentation. We're happy to answer any more questions that people might have.
Yes.
Looks like we're good.
Okay,
Thank you
great.
very much. We
Thank you
appreciate
for
your
your
time
time.
and energy.
I did want to say that in regards to this last presentation by the Department of Forestry, they are undergoing an HCP on their land, and we are doing one as well in the Elliott. And ODF has some of their own land in the Elliott, so we're having conversations about how to manage that. We're also looking at our properties. We've identified, when we hired our fabulous forester, Ryan Singleton, he's gone through and identified our properties. As you know, before, we had an intern identify who all the owners are next to our properties. And Ryan has gone out and looked at many of them. He's not quite done with his analysis to see which ones are some that we might want to trade with Oregon Department of Forestry, or some that we might want to sell, because they're so disparate. And as I think Liz mentioned, some of our properties are right next to their properties. And if you also heard her mention, because our properties are scattered, we have to ask for a lot of easements. That's expensive. So if we can offload some of those properties and reduce those expenses, that might be more beneficial. So we're reviewing all of that, and we'll report to you as we learn more information. All right, so we will move along to agenda item 6. If you are done asking questions on 5, I've asked Bill Ryan, our deputy, to join me at the table because he's going to present this report. We have a narrative in your notebook, and then Bill also has some slides prepared. And none of this can happen without our staff. I want to commend Andrea Celentano for her work. Andrea's sitting in the back, and she helped a lot with this report, as did other staff, and I think you're going to enjoy what you hear.
Good morning, Governor Brown, members of the board. For the record, my name is Bill Ryan.
I'm not sure you're on the microphone.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Bill Ryan. I'm Deputy Director of Operations here at the Oregon Department of State Lands, and I'm going to be giving a status report regarding one of our projects in the goal of continuously improving our stewardship of the Common School Fund. And so this is about the Aquatic Resource Management Program and our efforts to develop a sustainable funding program for that program. The first thing I want to do is explain what we mean by sustainable funding. And so for decades, the legislature has directed that the department's funding for protection of waters of the state basically come out of the Common School Fund. In our efforts to improve stewardship of the Common School Fund, we're looking at ways to reduce or eliminate the cost of the Common School Fund. So that's what we mean, is really trying to make sure that this Aquatic Resource Management Program, to the extent that we can, is not result in a draw on the Common School Fund. And I'm gonna basically give you a preview of what the findings of the studies that we've done regarding the program are. Basically, bottom line is that the ARM charges for services do not consistently cover operating expenses, and I'll get a little bit more into detail on that. And actually the major factor behind this is actually the extreme episodic costs that we've encountered. We've had some mention of the abandoned derelict vessels and illegal camping issues that we've had on state-owned waterways, as well as liability associated with the Portland Harbor Superfund cleanup. And so these are episodic costs that are kind of above and beyond what our normal, day-to-day, year-to-year program costs and revenues accommodate. And so the bottom line is that we need to do some additional work to look at those costs, but also look at the day-to-day program costs and revenues, and looking at ways to increase revenues and reduce costs, with really a focus based upon the department's efforts to, we are constantly trying to reduce costs and expenditures, but really efforts to look at ways to increase revenues in a way that's equitable and that makes sense. I knew I would do this. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble here. Hey, Greg, can you go back on that? Thank you. Thank you very much. So actually, next slide. So the first thing I want to do is describe the Aquatic Resource Management Program. So the program basically protects and administers the removal fill, it protects the waters of the state, and it administers the removal fill program and wetlands conservation laws, but also protecting public use trust values on state-owned waterways. And so waters of the state include rivers, lakes, wetlands, estuaries, and the territorial sea. Those waters provide numerous functions that benefit current and future generations of Oregonians, including clean water, flood protection, fish and wildlife habitat, and recreational opportunities.
Bill, I'm just going to stop you with more of a rhetorical question than anything, but I'm curious why the legislature believes that it's appropriate to pay for this particular program out of common school funds. What is the, other than obviously preserving the beauty and bounty of Oregon, what is the direct benefit to Oregon's school children?
Madam Chair, may I add on to your rhetorical question? My note, when I was reading through this, if I interpreted correctly, that 20% of the costs are covered, does this mean 80% are subsidized by the Common School Fund? And if that's true, why are we suggesting that we wait till 2023 to address that rather than 2020?
I'm willing to, if I have comrades in arms, I am willing to do battle on this issue in 2021, but I'm not doing it by myself.
Thank you.
Okay, all right.
It was rhetorical, as I said.
Yes, yes.
Governor Brown and members of the board, I'd like to address that rhetorical question. I mean,
Because we've had the same conversation
Yeah.
internally.
and so I don't think it was a strategic decision in terms of long-term cost benefit. I think it really was at the time at which the removal fill law was put into effect, which was 50 years ago. It was the Department of State Lands, and at that point the Water Resources Department also, were a place where that program could live, and it just has lived in the Department of State Lands, whose revenue comes from the Common School Fund. And at the time that law was put in place, the fees that the department were allowed to charge were set in statute, and I don't think they were probably adequate at that time, and they've not been increased adequately over time as well. And I'll get a little more into detail on that further in my presentation, but that's kind of the bottom line, is that it's just where the program lives. And as you know, getting general fund or other sorts of funding is challenging, is a challenging legislative lift, as would be dramatically increasing fees.
But I'd love to hear from our certified smart legal folks, if beneficiaries were to challenge this as a funding source for our aquatic resource management, how likely the beneficiaries would win in court on this issue.
And Governor, that's certainly a much more, the answer to that would be much more complicated than I would offer right now. The only comment I would make is that there are two different portions of the Common School Fund, constitutional and statutory, and this program is funded from the statutory,
Statutory side, okay.
which the legislature has considerably more control over than our constitutional half. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt.
And as you know, Governor, all of us having served in the legislature before, those fee fights are not pretty in the legislature. Anytime we go to raise fees, everyone freaks out in the vernacular. So one of the reasons we have targeted the 23 session is because it's going to take some time to work with stakeholders to get them interested and excited about the changing fee schedule. But as Bill continues to give you information, he'll tell you how we think we might be able to manage this. And I will say that we started on this project because when y'all hired me, you asked me to look for efficiencies and trying to save money for what we do here. And the department had been looking at this for some time, but I've made it a priority, and we're making it a priority as much as we can. So I think Bill's going to be able to tell us a little bit more as he goes through it, where we see we can alter this to stop draining the Common School Fund.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Yeah, so in addition to protecting waters of the state statewide, the ARM program also protects state-owned navigable waterways. And those are the waterways that were navigable at the time of statehood in 1859, were given to the state to manage, to protect them for the public trust values of navigation, fishing, commerce, and recreation. And so examples of those waters include the Columbia River, the Willamette River, large navigable rivers, as well as the territorial seas along the Oregon coast. Next slide, please. So the ARM program generates revenue from two primary sources, authorizations and lease for use of the state-owned waterways, and then also for permits, permit fees for removal fill permits, and also wetland delineation fees. When the program revenue does not exceed, when the program revenue doesn't exceed operating expenses, then the Common School Fund earnings revenue is used, and that's those statutory revenues that Matt referred to. So in situations where on a biennial basis the revenues don't exceed the cost, then it comes out of the Common School Fund statutory funding. And so so we basically have done some studies to look at ways that we can change the leasing rates and the permit fees, looking at what other states do, that sort of thing, to see what are some options that we have for improving the situation. Next slide, please. So in 2018, we did an in-depth study of the department's waterway leasing rates using the framework of equity, administrative and economic efficiency, and whether current rents reflect market rates. Thank you. And actually, can you advance, please? There we go. And actually, if you can just show the whole slide, that would be helpful. And Vicki already did the shout out to Andrea, but I wanted to add that again because we actually hired Andrea as a Hatfield summer intern or summer fellow, and she did such a great job on the waterway leasing study that we basically hired her full time to continue this work because she just showed amazing analytic and reporting skills. So thank you, Andrea, for that. So basically what that study found was that waterway revenue covers the proprietary program's typical operating expenses, and also that staffing levels and costs for staffing have remained stable for several biennia. So it's not like the program's been growing in terms of staffing and those personal services costs, but it's those episodic expenses that I had mentioned, like Portland Harbor and the ADV cleanups, that have really bit into that. So bottom line is on a normal year, the program does pay for itself, but when there is an episodic high expense, it doesn't. So it's kind of breaking even, but there isn't extra from year to year. Next slide, please. So, yeah, just advance through those, please. So basically, I mentioned that. These issues are really related to the state's liability as the owner of the lands underneath the navigable waterways. And so we have liability as an owner under CERCLA for the Portland Harbor Superfund site, also for the ADV cleanups, and I think there's one more button, there it is, and then for camping cleanups as well. So the abandoned and derelict vessels is really, vessels, old boats. Vicki mentioned that earlier. Folks basically living in those on the waterway without authorization. But then we also have a lot of camps that have developed along the waterways that are below ordinary high water, and so within the state's navigable waterway ownership. And so those actually can result in significant accumulations of trash and environmental degradation as well. And those are some pictures there from north of Portland along the Columbia. Unfortunately, those large episodic costs make it very difficult to predict what costs are going to be in the future. And so we were surprised, and the board is well aware of what happened with the Goble site cleanup, which cost $12 million. We sometimes can get reimbursed for that. There was the New Carissa 10 years ago or so, and actually there was a settlement. Was it 20? Wow.
It was 20 years ago.
Wow.
Look in your employee news.
Time flies, yes. So that, in that the state actually got reimbursed significantly for that, but to the tune of about $21 million. But can't predict whether there'd be those kinds of sources, especially for these sorts of costs. And the issue of the illegal camping and the ADVs, we don't really, it's sort of a new and emergent issue, and so we don't really have historic costs or data that we can use to predict that in the future. So that makes it challenging figuring out basically what kind of additional funding we'd want as a rainy day fund if that was one of the options we were looking at to address these cost overruns. Next slide, please.
And I will tell you on, we have an employee newsletter now, and thank you to Ken Armstrong for putting that together. And in this month's edition that just came out today are several pictures of the New Carissa, because it has been 20 years since that happened. And yeah, I know, Bill, time really flies. But they were amazing pictures, and that took a long time to resolve, as you may know. All right, back to you.
Okay, so Ashley, can we go back a slide, please?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Thank you very much. So the waterway leasing rate study that Andrea did basically came up with some recommendations for moving forward. But I wanted to talk just briefly about how we determine the leasing rates for use of the publicly or the state-owned waterways. There are three methods that we use. There's a method called the riparian land value rate method, which is a formula based upon the value of the adjacent upland area. There's a flat rate method, which is determined by multiplying basically the area of the proposed use by a specific rate that's unique to that use. For instance, marine industrial or non-marine industrial, that sort of thing. Then there's also a percentage of gross method, which is basically 3% of the gross receipts of the entity. And so we're looking at ways to increase revenues, but do so in a way that improves equity. And by equity, I'm talking about our real estate asset management plan actually defines equity as like leases paying like rents for like properties. So meaning that two adjacent properties would have with similar areas would have similar rates, and that those rates would make sense based upon the geographic location where they are. As we know, with real estate, location. Lease of a waterfront property in Portland is different from lease of a rate of a waterfront property in Klamath Falls, or at least it should be. And under our flat rate method, that's not the case. So if we can improve equity among leases, then the market rates will be captured better. And so one of the main recommendations is to use a real market value for the riparian land value calculation as opposed to the assessed value. Because as we know, assessed value doesn't always match real market value really well. And we also can improve economic efficiency and rent equity by discontinuing use of the state flat-wide rate. And that's what I talked about having. We can still have a flat rate, but maybe have them more regionally defined based upon the real market values of those like uses. And I do want to back up a little bit to say that the reason we have the 3 ways of calculating is so that lessees have options to determine what's the best way for them to lease, basically what's the lowest cost for them. Then the third recommendation is to actually get rid of the 3% of gross receipts calculation method. It's one that's not used very often, and it's administratively very burdensome for the department to calculate that and recalculate it with the lessee every year. And so that's something I would propose that we look at phasing out that. So those reforms would all be made through rulemaking of our Division 82 rules. So there'd be a public process for that, not something we can just do overnight, but the department is proposing that we do some more data collection, some more analysis, and then engage stakeholders to look at these various options.
And you'll see Treasurer read that last bullet point, reforms to waterway leasing insurance requirements. That gets us at the global problem.
Right, and so in that we had some pushback when we first suggested that last year, so that's something we'll need to work through a little bit. But that's one way to get at this issue of these episodic costs. Next slide, please. And if we can just go all the way through, thank you. So, the funding analysis showed that the program revenue doesn't cover the costs, and that is on a regular basis. For the actual removal fill permit fees and the wetland delineation fees don't cover the costs of those. And it's the waterway leasing revenues that do cover those on a normal year or a normal basis. The study also determined that, that we've got about 20% coverage there. Personnel costs really have been pretty flat. They've risen minimally for the last 10 years, increasing less than 1% per year. So actually, once again, it's not because we've staffed up a bunch that these costs are going up. It's really the costs and the amount of work associated with doing the permit processing.
And I would mention, Governor and Land Board members, we did have, and currently still have, I'll give a report later, a very huge removal fill project that simply paid the filing fee, yet it's consumed 15 years of staff time, and it only paid the filing fee. So we really need to look at recovering our costs.
Yeah, next slide, please. So for the removal fill permit fees, they're volume-based, and that was set in statute 1989 when the Wetlands Conservation Law went into effect. And so it's really basically, there's a base fee, and then it goes up incrementally based upon what the volume of removal and fill is. The challenge is that it really doesn't account for the geography of the project, doesn't account for the complexity of the project. The fees are just much too low. And you can see our maximum fee of $12.92 does cover administrative costs for a relatively simple removal fill permit process, but for a complex one, or one that gets contested, or one that gets multiple iterations, it doesn't even come close to the amount of money that it takes, administrative costs to process that.
This is outrageous. This should not wait until 2023. The studies are all dated 2017 to 2019, and by 2023, folks will say, oh, we need an updated study. And B, the fact that this hasn't been updated since 1989 is just absolutely unacceptable. So I obviously feel strongly about this. I'm seeing my fellow land board members head nod. We'd obviously want to check in with the Secretary of State as well and her team, but I do not, this should not and cannot wait until 2023.
I got goosebumps. Thank you, Governor. I appreciate that support. And whenever I get goosebumps, that means I'm pretty excited about it. So I'm glad that we've had this study done. It really has put a clear window in front of us to see just exactly what we're paying for here at the department.
Oregonians would be outraged if they understood. So, and I am.
Thank you. Bill?
Thank you,
have more?
Governor. Next slide, please. So this slide is really just looking at some of the recommendations from the study. Bottom line is that we need to do some more internal analysis to determine what particular types of permit processing cost, in terms of staff time. And so getting a better sense of that, and coming up with some proposals for different types of rate fee structures. One example that we've looked at is DEQ, actually just a few years ago, got a new fee structure for their 401 water quality certification. And so that's something we would look at, and it basically has 4 tiers based upon the complexity of the project. So that's the kind of thing that we would look at, but obviously wanting to have the information to back up whatever that structure would look like. So we need to do some more homework internally to get ready for that kind of an ask. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I think we kind of covered this. We basically need to move forward and address this issue. I very much appreciate the board's sense of urgency here. I do want to say that this has been an ongoing problem, and so it's something that really has just kind of risen more to the forefront. Most recently with the development of our strategic plan, making that a priority item, and then Director Walker's encouragement to look at ways to improve our stewardship of the Common School Fund. So thank you very much, and if you have any other questions.
Treasurer Reed? I think we've both spotted off enough.
Yep.
No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bill, I appreciate it. We are going to move to agenda item 7, which is the Common School Fund Audit Summary. I'll invite Tanya Moffett, the CPA and Managing Partner at Marina and Company, up to the table to talk about that. But while she's getting seated, I do want to share with you something that Lee Hollinger in our fiscal department brought to me this morning that's going to make your eyes light up and a smile on your face. And that's the Senate Bill 1566 distribution. I've put it at your desk there. If you notice, if you go to the very bottom line, you'll see that we transferred $21,360,850 on January 31st under Senate Bill 1566 to lower the PERS costs. So, Governor, I think you're happy about that.
I am very happy about the reduced employer rate for jurisdictions across the state, and really appreciate your team's work to implement this legislation. So,
we were very happy we didn't have a GOBLE this year, and GOBLE is what caused that amount to be lower next year. So our ever-present goal here is to make sure we keep those unexpected episodes to a minimum, so that we can continue to see these kinds of distributions. So, and if you have any questions about that, Lee can come up and speak to that. But right now, I'd really like to hear from Tanya, because I love the work they do for us. They come in and make sure that we're operating financially on the up and up here with our Common School Fund, and I think she'd like to share some positive news with you.
Governor Brown, Treasurer Reed, and others. I am Tanya Moffett, and I am the partner with Marina and Company, and we do the outhouse audit. This is the first time I've heard this terminology. We complete the outhouse audit for the Common School Fund, or the external audit, since the Secretary of State sits on the board. And so we're a little bit unique here in the fact that this is the only major fund in the state of Oregon that is audited by an external agency. We completed our audit, and we have an unmodified opinion, which is the highest level of an opinion that we can give on a financial statement. When we came in, we had full access to all of the records. There were no restrictions placed on our audit scope. There was no disagreements with management. There's no new significant accounting policies, which is not something I can say very regularly. The Government Accounting Standards Board, who sets the regulations for municipal financial statements, they have been very active active recently. So the June 30, 2019 financial statements are comparable to the June 30, 2018. I can't say that very often right now. So if you look at them, they are comparable. We didn't find any transactions entered into by the Common School Fund that lacked authoritative guidance. So our opinion is an unmodified opinion. I'd like to thank the Director Walker, as well as Deputy Director Straight, and her team, which included Lee Hollinger, Star Thompson, and Teresa Crawford, and others within the organization that helped us be able to do the audit and have full access to everything. Does anybody have any questions on the financial statements?
Looks like you're clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we said outhouse with all due respect. So.
All right, thank you so much, Tanya, I appreciate it. I always look forward to seeing you. All right, we'll move to agenda item 8, which is my other category. And so I've got a couple of things for you today. We're going to start out with talking about the South Slough Reserves Forest and Fire Management Project. I was so impressed with the folks at South Slough and what they've been doing that I wanted to share it with the land board and members of the public. So let me just give a little background. Since the fall of 2019, the South Slough has been undertaking an exciting multi-benefit forestry project at its visitor center. And if you've not been to their visitor center, it's in Charleston, just outside of Charleston, and it's quite lovely. And I spend a lot of money in the gift shop for the grandchildren. But they do a lot of work there, a lot of research projects, education projects for the children. If you go in the spring, there are kids there every day. Lots of school children come out. So the staff looked at the visitor center and decided that they needed to make some improvements, and one of those was in the fire danger. So let's talk about that. The visitor center was constructed in the mid-1980s on what was cleared forest land at the top of a ridge overlooking the South Slough estuary. The forest surrounding the visitor center was never thinned. It grew back very dense and tall and eventually blocked the view. So when you were on the observation deck, you couldn't even see the South Slough. That wasn't the main problem, however. The main problem is that some of these trees became diseased. In the spring of 2018, the reserve received a grant of $137,000 from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for improvements at the visitor center. And we do receive a lot of funding from NOAA grants. They've been a terrific partner. We needed to replace the observation deck. There was forestry work that needed to reestablish that view corridor, had to renovate the gutter system on the building, and we installed a demonstration rain garden to capture rainwater runoff and provide interpretive information on ecologically and culturally significant native plants. So on that level, given that we have less rainwater available, that was awesome. And then we also had the tribes come in and talk to us about native plants and provide some of those to us. So Dr. Alice Yates was hired as the reserve stewardship coordinator in the summer of 2019. She wasted no time getting involved, and as the project lead, she contributed invaluable expertise and experience in forest ecology, science education, and collaborative project management. There was also a technical advisory group involved. She being Dr. Yates, developed a comprehensive forest enhancement plan that expanded the project focus to reduce the fire risk, improve forest health, and increase wildlife habitat, and enhance education and outreach opportunities. And that advisory team included some really great folks from OSU Extension, Oregon Department of Forestry, Bureau of Land Management, Department of State Lands, and Coos Watershed Association. The plan was approved by the Management Commission, which I chair, in August of 2019. And during the planning process, Dr. Dr. Yates coordinated site visits with the advisory team to complete fire assessments and develop a plan to reduce fire risk. After implementation commenced, 2 representatives from OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension conducted an additional site visit to reassess the fire risk after the first phase of work was completed. They identified additional management actions to further protect the building and surrounding areas. I think this is awesome, and I think, reserve staff, they worked with Coos Forest Protective Association and a local tree service to thin a 0.75 acre area of dense regrowth forest within a 200-foot radius of the visitor center. The work crews pruned lower tree limbs, removed dead Port Orford cedar trees, and thinned the dense understory shrubs and trees. What got me so excited, Governor, was when I saw Senate Bill 1536 in draft form, and now I've seen it today. Among the many objectives of this bill that you've introduced this session, Senate Bill 1536 hopes to reduce wildfire risks by demonstrating defensible space on public and private lands. And so the South Slough is really proud to showcase how fire and landscape mitigation on public land can meet those objectives. It was just really thrilling to hear about it. I'm anxious to go visit the reserve and see all of that fine work. So in addition to reducing the fire risk, these thinning activities also promoted diversity and habitat complexity and benefited a myriad of animals, including songbirds, bats, and insect pollinators. These are all important parts of our ecosystem. So through partnership and creative thinking, the reserve was able to expand the positive impacts of this project by donating and utilizing many of the felled trees. 120 logs of approximately 10 feet in length were equally divided between the Coquille Indian tribe and the Confederated tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians for cultural use. Attached is a letter from the C.T. Klutzy about this donation. It's a wonderful letter that I've provided to you, and it is on our website. And the tribe says that these donated logs will be used in many upcoming cultural activities, from paddle and cedar box making to plank splitting and carving demonstrations. Cedar, much like salmon, is the lifeblood of our culture. It provides us with medicine, clothing, housing, and transportation, and without cedar, we wouldn't be who we are as tribal people. It was really a very touching letter, and we were just so pleased that we could offer these trees to the tribes. And currently, Chief Brainerd serves on the Management Commission with me. He sits in the tribal seat currently, and he was instrumental in suggesting that as well. Additional Port Orford cedar logs were split on site. Staff are constructing benches to be installed along the trails. Remaining logs are being milled at a local sawmill and will be used in education programs for building wildlife boxes. Western hemlock and Sitka spruce logs will be used in the upcoming stream restoration project. And the reserve made efforts to donate firewood from the removed Douglas fir trees to Oregon Coast Community Action for its energy assistance program, but it was not possible to do that at this time, but we will keep them in mind for future projects. The demonstration rain garden was completed by reserve staff and volunteers in January of this year and enriched with a diversity of native pollinator food plants and culturally important plants donated by C.T. Klutzy. And the garden incorporates an ADA accessible path for all visitors to access the observation deck and will include interpretive signage and bench seating. It's tremendous what they do here at South Slough, and I'm hoping that some future land board meeting might occur at the South Slough. I think it would be great for us to get out and see this other part of what we do here at DSL. Staff at the South Slough Reserve recognize clear communication is important for any land management project, and they received approval from local tribes. The Management Commission, they conducted public site tours and presentations and created interpretive signage to help visitors understand the forestry work and visualize the project objectives. It is a place of teaching. So the South Slough utilized all of those aspects in this project. The area will be enhanced with native flowering shrubs and wildlife boxes, and reserve staff are working with local tribes to incorporate culturally significant plants and develop education materials, and participants of the reserve's inaugural Second Saturday Stewards Program will plant shrubs and install wildlife boxes on February 8th, coming up this weekend. The project area will serve as a demonstration site for workshops and community classes to educate the public on how to reduce fire risk on their own property. Reserve staff are currently working with OSU Extension agents to host a spring workshop focused on creating defensible space for reducing risk of fire. And outreach opportunities for the reserve will continue in the future to educate others. After many years of dense forests enclosing the visitor center, reserve visitors are now able to view the South Slough estuary and obtain a sense of connection with the surrounding watershed. These efforts will continue because they're ecologically and culturally important, and I'm proud to have the South Slough as part of what we do here at DSL, and I can't tell you how proud I am of the staff and their research that they do for us and for the state of Oregon, and the education they provide to our children.
Thank you, Director Walker. Really appreciate the report and the update, and I look forward to visiting. I know the treasurer does, and I'm hoping we can get the land board down there at some point in the future. The last time I was down, it was quite overgrown, so I look forward to seeing the new and improved version. So I don't know that you have, do you have anything else?
I have one final update.
Okay, all right.
And it'll be quick. I needed to update you on Jordan Cove. As the board is aware, the proposed Jordan Cove Energy Project will require a removal fill permit, as well as multiple authorizations for use of state-owned waterways from the department. Jordan Cove was to provide all information to us to make a decision on January 31, but they had not done so. So when they asked for an extension, I refused to grant that. Therefore, Jordan Cove withdrew all following applications. The removal fill permit was withdrawn effective January 24, and on January 24, they also withdrew 12 applications for use of state-owned waterways. Jordan Cove's requests and the department's response are posted on our website on the Jordan Cove section for the public to see. Jordan Cove has not indicated whether they plan to submit a new removal fill permit application. They have requested that the department continue reviewing the wetland delineation report submitted by Jordan Cove Energy Project in May of 2018. The purpose of the wetland delineation report is to obtain the state's concurrence on wetland and waterway boundaries within a proposed project area. DSL concurrence with a wetland delineation report is required as part of a removal fill permit. The wetland delineation report review can be done independently, however, of a permit. DSL will continue its review of the wetland delineation report. Jordan Cove on January 20 submitted additional materials in response to DSL's comments on the delineation report. Staff anticipates completing review of this material by the end of March. DSL has notified Jordan Cove Energy Project of its timeline. DSL may also identify additional information needed or issue a partial concurrence. So let me indicate what a partial concurrence is so the public is aware. A partial concurrence indicates that the applicant did not have legal access to some parcels within the project area to make the wetland delineation. For those parcels, preliminary jurisdictional determinations will be made. preliminary determinations are insufficient for the removal fill permitting process. So at whatever time the applicant may obtain legal access to parcels, additional field work and DSL review would be necessary for the delineation report to be suitable for the permitting process. So we'll continue reviewing that report, expect it to be completed, our review by the end of March, and we'll alert you and the public if we have another removal fill application provided by the applicant. But as of now, that one is done. And
Thank you,
withdrawn.
Director Walker. Any questions? Seeing none, we have a few folks that would like to testify. I'm going to ask that they keep it brief, but it looks like we have at least 2 students that have been waiting extremely patiently, and I would invite Anna, Issa, and Raquel up to testify, please. Good morning. Please state your name for the record. I'm like, don't be shy. We'll be nice, I promise.
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Helms, and this is my daughter, Isa.
Issa. Okay.
Good morning, Governor Kate Brown, Vicki Walker, Department of State Lands. Again, Dai Annan San Milika. I'm a member of the Confederate Tribes of Kuslo, Umpqua, and Sayusla Indians. Thank you for giving us a few minutes of your time. I am not here as a representative for my tribe, but I'm certainly here to speak on behalf of my family. With the strength in that, we would like to express sincere gratitude to you all for the denial of extension. We appreciate the meaningful consultations you've had with our tribe. We appreciate being informed. We appreciate the leadership and sticking to the regulations around the water rights. And we are grateful that water has such a strong voice and is a reflection of the strength of our relationships to this place and with each other. Pembina's application process has been given a legitimate chance, and the project has been around for about 15 years. That's more than adequate time. Meanwhile, the process has been greatly unfair to the people who have lived and protected these waters and lands since time immemorial, and that Pembina has failed to have meaningful consultations with the Kuslo, Umpqua, and Sayusla Indians. And Pembina has failed to consider all of the items around the cultural and natural resources within the environmental impact statement. This lengthy process has also been incredibly costly, and my tribe would rather see those dollars be put into restoration projects in the SB 13 tribal history. It's evident that Jordan Cove Energy Project is not here to do us any favors, but to profit off of our resources while taking away from our local clam, oyster, and fish economy. While the largest emissions of greenhouse gas will have adverse effects on our climate. And I want to end with saying that our songs, stories, language, and cultural teachings come from the waters and the lands and perpetuate our unique identity. It is through our knowledge, beliefs, and stewardship that we take this stand and to continue to stand to protect our cultural resources. A pipeline works against what we work to protect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm sure you hated being out of school this morning to be here. Issa, would you like to say anything?
I don't have anything in mind right now, but... My name is Issa Helms. I'm a Melek Cuse member of the Cuse, Lower Umpqua, and Sayusla Indians. Over a year ago, my sister and I participated in the Department of State Lands comment period for the removal of fill permit process in Cuse Bay. Shortly after, we both received a handwritten letter from Governor Kate Brown. We are very thankful for your letters. It was a struggle for me to speak out that day, but receiving your letter helped me recover from what had happened and helped me to believe in the importance of speaking out for things that matter. Thank you. I am here today to give some acknowledgments to this process of fighting the Jordan Cove LNG project by what this process has meant to me, what motivated me to stay involved, and to express my gratitude to you all. This process has helped me to open up to the hard work, teachings, and gratitude the process of protecting the water, animals, and plants bring. When I think about the things that motivate me, I remind of what we have in Coos Bay is unique in that we have the dunes, oceans, islands, rivers, waterfalls, lakes, bays, sloughs, bogs, forests, and the mountains. All of these places have sustained the way of life in my culture and rest of the very heart of who I am. I want to thank you for keeping us informed of the project and this process, and thank you for listening.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Okay. My name is Raquel Helms Cheney, and like my sister, we are Millet Coos. When we heard that the Jordan Cove's request for extension was denied by DSL, my reaction was, huzzah! Because they've certainly taken up enough of our time. Thank you. I'd like to use this time to talk about the importance of Coos Bay and the water that brings us all there. Although we currently live in Eugene, we visit Coos Bay often. We dread the road trip, but when we're there, it's obvious that Coos Bay is our home, a place of happiness, love, and a good life. It's home to where we often gather foods for our table and materials to make things like baskets and regalia. It's home to where we hold ceremonies, celebrations, and other gatherings among our tribal community. Our ways of life truly depend on water, and there are several times where clean water is not available for various reasons. Let's not add to the harmful impacts of an LNG pipeline to the list. Lack of clean water comes down hard, especially as a tribal person. Water is also necessary in ceremonies which have sustained us and our communities since the time immemorial. For instance, when we are born, the ocean is used to strengthen and bless us into this life. And when we become Tetsuis, the water is used in the recognition of young people becoming women. When we continue to talk about the importance of water and protecting water, we pull towards our strengths together. In the near future, I hope we put more intent into restoring water, making it clean and available to use. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I have two other folks signed up, Mike Washburn, Dave Crane. Please come on up. Please make your remarks brief. I'm assuming neither one of you are elementary school kids, so.
Good morning. My name is Mike Washburn. My wife and I live just outside of Coos Bay. The Pembina gas pipeline is planned to run through our property and our neighbors' residentially zoned properties. There are 5 neighbors who have the same stream running through our properties. It ultimately feeds into the Coos Bay estuary. The proposed pipeline will cross this stream and will obliterate the water catchment system of one owner and jeopardizes the stream flow for the rest of us. The pipeline path will render parts of our properties useless. I want to thank DSL Director Vicki Walker for rejecting another request by Pembina to extend their Jordan Cove LNG application. Oregon's water quality standards should be foremost in all of our minds. Pembina and its predecessors have had 15 years to get their act together and develop a plan and application. The fact that they haven't done so suggests that they are not competent to pull off a project of this magnitude. Should Pembina reapply for their needed permits, I would hope that both you, Governor Brown, and Director Walker will tell them that there will be no further consideration by the state to grant any more extensions. I think they've used up all the extensions they need on the application over the last 15 years. Again, after 15 years of holding all affected landowners hostage, Pembina's inability to get the application right makes me wonder how competent they will be in building the plant and the pipeline. This is a dangerous proposition. Finally, I hope that you, Governor Brown, will protect Oregon's authority to stop Jordan Cove LNG, even if the federal government tries to change the rules. Taking our properties for the enrichment of a foreign business is outrageous. Thank you. One other quick question. This is an impromptu thing based on Ms. Walker's discussion of the South Sioux Sanctuary. It's a great place. Those people out there are doing a wonderful job. I wasn't going to say anything about it because I didn't know it was going to be on the agenda today, but you guys need to be proud of the staff down there. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Crane.
I'm Dave Crane. I'd like to thank the land board for being here and listening to us today. I feel that LNG ships would severely affect the fishing fleet out of Charleston. Both commercial and recreational boats need safe access to the ocean. I'd also like to mention that I've fished out of Charleston for over 40 years, and I've crossed the bar thousands of times and have a pretty good idea about the tides there. The safest time to cross the bar is on the last part of the incoming tide up to the top of the flood tide, as many of you know. This applies to small boats as well as to large LNG ships. If the LNG ships with their safety zones have priority, then there will be no room in the bay for ships to pass. Other craft will be forced to wait either in the ocean or in Charleston for the LNG ships to go by. When the weather is bad, waiting in the ocean is dangerous, if not deadly. Also, the favorable tide would be missed while the LNG ship utilizes it. Missing the tide could result in running the bar during the ebb tide with steep breaking waves. Waiting in Charleston would also be a problem because of boats milling around in constricted areas, waiting for the ships to go by. I've heard various estimates of the time it would take to have to wait for the ships, and I don't really know. The Coast Guard said 20 to 30 minutes, I heard, and I think that's the bottom. That's the minimum amount. It would generally be more than that, I would think, but I can't really say. So ship traffic is one more negative effect Jordan Cove LNG would have on the Coos Bay area. And Charleston fishing industry has always been a big part of the local and the state economy and does not need to be impacted by the LNG. Is there any questions any of you have? Okay.
Thank you. We really appreciate you joining us today. Before I adjourn, I need to do a correction of the record. And on our agenda item number 3, page 2 of the 4 pages, the proposed legislative concept refers to the Elliott State Forest, and it's a placeholder bill in anticipation of legislative or statutory needs to move forward on the transfer of the Elliott Forest to be operated as a research forest under the text reads University of Oregon's College of Forestry, which would horrify any beaver in the room. So my motion is to correct.
I can't believe I didn't see that. It's freaking me out.
Yes.
All right.
No. It's Mr. Minor's eagle eyes picked up on it. So my motion is to correct the record to refer to the proposed legislative concept as a placeholder bill under the Elliott State Forest to move forward on the transfer of the Elliott to be operated as a research forest under the Oregon State University's College of Forestry. Is there a second to the motion?
Yes, there is.
Okay, I thought there might be. Treasurer Reed?
Second the motion.
Oh,
All
my
right.
goodness.
Hearing and seeing no objection to the motion passes.
Governor, I apologize for that, and I read that too, and I have an eagle eye, a 25-year court reporter. I don't normally miss that. I don't know how. Malia Masiba is mortified herself.
Okay.
We will get that corrected on the website.
Thank you. I don't think anybody will take it personally. I know the University of Oregon beat University of Connecticut women's basketball last night by almost 20 points. UConn hasn't been beat in their home court in over 7 years. So I think the Ducks are feeling really good today, so I'm not sure they'll take offense at this one.
The women's basketball team has just been astounding this year.
Both of them are extraordinary. Both are really extraordinary.
It's been great. So I do want to make one comment before you close out the hearing. I wanted to assure everyone that the Jordan Cove Energy Project application that was before us received all kinds of due diligence from our staff, and decisions were made about that application that were based on fact and science and not ideology. I want to assure you that this department acts in full compliance with the state agency's expected way to act, which is not to allow ideology to influence our decisions. So you will most likely be seeing some draft findings because they've been requested, and all of our decisions are based on fact and science. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, seeing no further business to become before the State Land Board, we are adjourned.